Hey, writers, especially all you fantasy writers, I've got a great treat for you today. I've got Justin Minkel here with me. Welcome, Justin.
Thanks. Hi, everybody.
And we are going to dig into some world building stuff. And we have said this before, but we'll say it again. World building is for everybody. But today we're going to do a little bit of an angle in the fantasy world, which will be super fun. But let me introduce you writers to Justin a bit. He has always known that he wanted to be a writer since the second grade. And he grew up surrounded by the woods, creeks, and hollows of the Ozark Mountains, where he'd go on rambling adventures with characters from whatever fantasy book he was reading at the time. Justin is the author of the chapter book Clubhouse Clash for kids in grades 2 through 4. Awesome. His novel Winged, a fantasy novel for readers in middle grades inspired by the Icarus myth, is currently on submission. Justin has an MFA in creative writing for children and young adults from Hamline University. He mentors young writers through the Society of Young Inklings and works and loves working with young writers as their imaginations flourish and their stories unfold. Justin is also a bookseller at Pearls Books, a truly wonderful independent bookshop in his hometown of Fayetteville, Arkansas, where he lives with his 14-year-old son, 17-year-old daughter, his wife, and too many books to fit on the shelves, and a tender-hearted black cat named Smudge. That does sound like it would be part of a fantasy book. There's always the black cat causing trouble, right? So, welcome, Justin. It's great to have you here. And I know with all your fantasy writing that you especially love talking about world building. So, I'm really excited to have you here to talk about that. So, maybe we could start with something a bit simple, although I have a feeling it will end up unfurling into something complex. Um, when you go about creating a brand new world, as one often does for a fantasy novel, what does this look like at the beginning? Like how do you get the ball rolling in the process?
Yeah, I feel like for a long time I started writing the actual story too early. And so
Mm,
I feel like partly at Hamlin, just getting to work with really wonderful mentors who each had a totally different approach. It just helped me realize that I really should start, like, it's been about a month just kind of creating the world and the characters and letting it kind of emerge before I start like page one, chapter one. For me, I know everybody feels so differently about the process. For me, writing feels sort of like archaeology. Like it feels like there's already this world out there, and I just kind of have to unearth it. So I start off like doing a lot of maps for sure. I do like a field guide to the flora and fauna. Like I brought one of my notebooks, and I'll draw like, the trees that are there that are usually sort of roughly based on real trees, or like this animal is like called a thief squirrel, right? So it looks like a squirrel, but it has a little bandit mask like a raccoon. So just spending a lot of time kind of letting the world and the characters sort of surface. I was working with a really wonderful author and teacher at Hamlin, Elliot Schrafer, while I was drafting the first novel and this novel Winged. And originally, they just like all the kids like are in this valley, and I had the valley really, really clear, and all their houses like around the lake. But then the feedback that Elliot gave me was, like, what if they went further than they do in the story? Like when they build their wings and go beyond the valley, what if they went like all the way to the edge of their world? And I realized like, oh, I don't really know what the edge of their world looks like, right? And so then it was like a lot of kind of like doing what kids do, like cutting construction paper and gluing. And I kind of realized like the world was kind of this like wheel of stone surrounded by ocean with their valley right in the center. So yeah, more and more I just feel like there's a lot of like drawing involved and a lot of kind of like letting all these details emerge, not really knowing if they'll make it into the plot, and if so, how.
yeah, interesting. So you mentioned drawing a lot. Do you also illustrate, or are these sketches for your
No, I
own
do not
purposes?
illustrate that. Yeah, they're purely for myself. Yeah, like I bought one of those big rolls of butcher paper and just kind of unfurled it, not so much for like outlining, but just kind of like drawing what happens. Because there are all these things like these cloud ships. They're kind of like hot air balloons with a woven hole underneath that looks more like a ship's hull, and just kind of think through the mechanics of,
Yeah,
it just really helps, I think, to do like diagrams for me.
yeah, yeah. So do you find that you do this every time you start, or has your process maybe shifted when you start a new project, or do you still kind of go into it using the same strategy?
Yeah, that's really changed because a lot of times I think people, even in like NPR interviews, they'll ask a writer like, "What's your process?"
Yes.
Everybody has one process, and I feel like like if anyone watching this is a parent, like you don't have a parenting process. Like it's different for each child if you have more than one kid, right? And it's different as they age. So I feel like that about writing. And one of the things I loved about doing an MFA, or having critique group partners, is that writing can be so solitary. It's like your brain alone in a room a lot of the time. And so I love to have another person's brain involved, and it kind of gets you out of your defaults. So, like with my very first advisor at Hamlin, she had me do this process she called intentional generativity that I think is great if you haven't written for a little while, or if you're feeling stuck, or if you like just finished revising a novel and you spent a year on it. Where every single day she was like, I want you to write just to write. The way like you go running, like on a jog, just to jog, not always like because you're training for a 5K or for a marathon. So she sent me all these prompts that were like from her brain, right? Not mine. And then every day I would write like 3 to 5 pages in response to that prompt. And then I would just stop. And she was like, then just like put them away. They're not meant to be a product, for anyone ever to see. But if one of them really like calls to you, then you can go back to it. So the very first prompt that I did ended up turning into this novel, right? But I think I was like holding it more loosely and not as like in my head about, is this good? Is it going to be publishable? Because it wasn't meant that way. And then 4 of them turned into short stories. So I love that process. Lately, I've been doing like prompts in response to images. Like I really loved this like old grumpy gnome that my sister
Yeah.
at an art fair. So I wrote this story about this gnome and how he ends up like kind of healing these animals that he's originally planning to eat. So kind of doing like visual prompts, I think is great. So yeah, and I just realized more and more. I think it's fun to like try different processes because then the work kind of gets you out of your defaults. Like I would normally set every single story in the forest, which is where a lot of mine are. But when I had a prompt from this mentor that said, imagine a girl's on a colony on Mars and she wakes up and like goes to school. It was meant as a world building exercise, but it made me like do a ton of research about Mars, right? And it was just such a different process because it wasn't set with all my defaults with like trees,
Right.
creeks.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. So you mentioned earlier that maybe you used to start trying to form the story before you had considered, all the stuff that might go into the world. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, how did you know it was a problem?
I think like with that example of my advisor saying like, what if they went out to the edge of the world? And I realized I only know this tiny little valley. I have no idea what's beyond it. Neither do the characters, right? Which was kind of
Yeah.
exciting. And I'd worked with this author, Laura Ruby, who had me do a bunch of, she calls it like place-based world building, where basically you're doing these things like creating a calendar of all the festivals that people have throughout the year. And you're writing about, like all the legends that people tell there. And what I find a lot is like it's like that line, geography is destiny. Like the physical landscape really matters. So for this valley, I imagined it like totally surrounded by cliffs, and there are these mountains, and it sort of looked like a flower from above, right? Like the lake is like the eye of the flower, and there are these peaks that are like the petals. I mean, it ended up being really important because the kids aren't able to like go beyond the valley, and like that's why the protagonist builds wings like for his friends and for him, so they can go beyond because they have to go get a cure when all the adults like fall ill into this sort of like coma and can't use the technology that the adults know, like these cloud ships. So again, it's not like I knew that when I was going into it, but just that those details ended up really mattering.
Yeah.
And I think
Yes.
like we think that we know like our brain, like we think our brain is our brain, and I really what we think of as our brain is like 15% maybe, and there's so much subconscious. And so I think that's the other benefit of spending a long time, like not only the intentional things you're doing, like the drawing and the thinking and the character exercises, but also just like your back brain's working when you're taking a walk or doing the laundry, even if you don't realize it, right? Like the story is sort of coalescing.
Yeah. So now that you've had that experience, like moving forward with other experiences, do you kind of have a sense for like, okay, I've done enough now that I can get started, or like, ooh, I know I haven't done enough now. I need to keep going. Like, do you have a way to sort of gauge your progress in that?
Yeah, I think it feels very intuitive for me and probably for most people. Like
Hmm.
with this last novel that I just finished a rough draft of, it was a sequel, so it was a little different because I knew more about the characters, but it was still this totally new world and everything. And at some point I just felt like, okay, I'm tired of being like sort of this like puppet master thinking about the plot. Like I just want to put the kids in the ocean and see what happens, sort of. And of course I had some thoughts, but I really love character driven stuff, which is kind of I think the inverse of doing all that time on the place. But like once the characters come, like they start to feel really real.
Mm.
I'm sure a lot of people watching this have had this experience, but it's my favorite moments as a writer is when a character does something that I wasn't expecting, right? Like I was writing, I was like, oh, like, and it feels like they did it, not me sort of pulling the strings. And so I do think in some way it just feels like, okay, it's time to now see what the characters do in this world with this idea I have that may not be the actual idea that unfolds by the end.
Yeah. Yeah, I find I'd be curious to hear your experience on this as well. I find that sometimes in working with fantasy writers that they almost can become so in love with world building that they just get like trapped in this hamster wheel. It feels like of like, I'm gonna make another thing. I'm gonna, create another gadget. And at some point you want to be like, maybe we should move ahead now.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it reminds me of like my grandfather. His method of parking a car was to hit the car in front and then hit the car in back and then level out, right? And I think like most writers like kind of go to those extremes sometimes. And so for me, I feel like at some point it can become procrastination, right? It's like
Hmm.
I can do these other things, but for me, because I tend to, I think, be kind of impatient to like begin the story. It really helped me. Like Nina LaCour, like did this great workshop, and she talked about the idea of spending time with your novel, which is different from writing it. But like even if
Yeah.
you're not writing fantasy, just doing kind of character exercises, right? Like what's in their closet or those prompts, like the thing I've never told anyone is sort of as your character, or even like taking a walk, like method acting, trying to like walk the way your character walks, notice what they would notice, think about what they think about. Like I think that can be helpful. And the other thing I would say is, there are these articles about kind of like world building versus world conjuring. And I think it's more what you call it, but it's the idea of like you don't want to have this like encyclopedia for the most cases. I mean,
Yeah.
some readers like that, but I think usually young readers like they more want the story and being immersed in the character. So all these details you've created, they may never come into the story itself, right?
Right.
But when they do, it's so fully detailed and realized. Like when I was doing this calendar of festivals, right? Most of the festivals didn't make it into the book, but there was one like in the winter festival, they do the festival of the joust, where the kids like do sled jousting, where they go flying down a ramp on a sled, and they use lances, and they try to like knock each other off, and there are these rounds, and that ended up being like, one of the early scenes in the book that did end up mattering.
Yeah. That's super fun. Yeah, I think what you're saying here makes a lot of sense. And that, I like how you mentioned how it can be a procrastination tactic if one is not careful, because it can be hard to move on to something of creating a story plot line. It might feel safer for a person to think about, new vegetation or a new kind of animal or something to introduce. But no, I love that. So I assume that we are going to have plenty of writers here in our audience. We know that fantasy is super popular with both middle grade and YA audiences, and people love to write it too, of course. So for writers who might be newer to writing this genre, whether they're new writers or trying it as something new, do you have some tips for creating a world that, I mean, we want the world to feel fantastical, but we also want it to feel like it's authentic and something that the characters can actually be in. Like there's this fine line between making something so bizarre that we can't really feel like we're a part of it. So, do you have some tips for creating good, authentic fantasy worlds?
Yeah, I think one thing that Laura Ruby taught me that I hadn't really thought about is overlaying the fantastical place on a real place. And that really
Mm,
worked out for me with this Icarus book because our family was in New York State for the year. And, when you're in a new place, you just notice things more than if you're in your
yes.
hometown where you've lived for 20 years. And so, I would go walking in like the winter woods and it felt like field work. So I was really paying attention, like, what does the snow sound like as I'm stepping? Like, what does a frozen pond sound like when you start to put your weight on it and the ice starts to crack? Or I'd just be like driving my son to school and see like these trees that were tapped for maple syrup, right? And so it kind of felt like everything was sort of making its way into the story, even though I don't think anyone reading it would say, oh, that's, the Hudson River Valley of New York State. But it helped for me because, of course, you can change everything, but you do have sort of this geography in place. And I know Laura Ruby will go really deeply into even like the history of that town and what, like festivals in the town, like actual things that happen. And then you've got something to sort of change. Like you and I were talking about before the interview began about kind of drafting versus revision.
Yes.
I was thinking about that Michelangelo quote, like when he sculpted the horse, right? He just took away all the marble that wasn't the horse. But I think for writers, we have to make the block of marble first and then take away everything that's not the horse, right? And some people have rougher first drafts, some have more polished. But I still think it helps sometimes to like have something to work with. That's also why I love sort of retellings, is that and it's not like this is an actual retelling of the Icarus myth, but there were so many details that I didn't know about the myth that I learned that sort of like sparked an idea. And it's kind of that idea of having a brain other than your brain. It's not just my ideas or like doing research for the story set on Mars, right? I think the more you can kind of like go outside your usual kind of world and kind of, room of imagination, the more interesting the story tends to be.
Yeah. Okay, you and I can be kindred writing spirits because you mentioned the Michelangelo thing with the Hunk of marble, because I think about that all the time, and I feel like having the hunk of marble, it's like I need certain I need like a certain container. Like I need to know the genre and the age category and the like the general feel for the book before I can begin. Whereas some people maybe will start a story and then decide where they're gonna put it. I don't know, but there are certain things that I have to have in place. I feel like that's getting my hunk of mar hunk of marble and then just like chipping away to find the story within. So I love that you mentioned that because I think about that all the time. No, that's fantastic. So you mentioned that you have this book that's out on submission. Are you also writing something else right now? You don't have to give us any details, but are you writing more fantasy for middle grade or something else?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I spent a long time on, it could be a standalone, but I kind of see it as a sequel because it has the same protagonist and sequentially came after that Icarus story. And it's totally different because it's sort of like an ocean voyage. But I feel like the
Yeah.
seed was planted in my head because there's this part at the end of the first book where the kid who made the wings is sort of like his hubris moment where he's flying out over the ocean because he just wants to know what's beyond and what's beyond that and what's beyond, and then he just like crashes into the sea, right? But as he's flying out, he sees something on the horizon and wonders what it is, and so that sort of put this ocean voyage in my head for the second book.
Yeah.
I also just love sequels. Like I have this book that I had in second grade. It's all tattered now, right? Lloyd Alexander. But I just remember reading this book, and it was the first sequel I'd ever read, and it was like seeing friends again. Where it's like, oh my gosh, like
Yeah.
Lanawi and Tarn. Like it's like I don't have to just reread the story; they're here again. Which of course is part of what people love about series. But since then, I've been doing that kind of intentional generativity thing of just like every day or every few days, kind of like just starting a story in response to a prompt, knowing it will probably never turn into anything I try to get published. Because I think it's like that line from Philip Pullman, who wrote The Golden Compass and those other his Dark Materials. He said, responsibility and delight can coexist. I think it's easy to lose the delight when you're starting to get
Hmm.
serious about writing and you're maybe querying your 50th agent or whatever, or you thought getting an agent was the key and now it's still not getting published or picked up.
Yeah.
That I think like going back to that, like writing because it's fun and writing just to write is really important for me.
Yeah, I love that you said that because I do find, and I'm guilty of this as well, that with a lot of writers, it's all about like what function is this writing going to serve? What is it going to like we put a great deal of weight through accomplishment. Like it's got to be for something. It can't just be because you felt like doing it. Like that almost never comes up in conversation. So I love that you mentioned that. Well,
Well,
if people,
you know,
oh, sorry.
oh, sorry, I was just going to say, like, Laurel Snyder did this wonderful lecture at Hamline called The Craft of Daydreams. And she talked about, like, kind of trying to remember how you created when you were a kid, right? It usually wasn't
Mm,
for the product. It wasn't even maybe for the audience. And the idea of, like she will literally, like, get underneath a table or, like, take a walk and pick up objects that spark ideas or, like, make the world out of clay. And so I really like that idea of when you get too in your head about it or sort of too serious.
yeah.
Going back to that, and then I was thinking too about like Ilana K. Arnold was another like wonderful writing teacher I had who talked about how like in a workshop or whatever else, like what people really want to know is kind of like, is this good? And what they're really saying is, am I good? Right? Am I good at writing? And it's so important to kind of add, like she asked these three questions instead when she's done with the draft, like what have I made? And just really looking at what you've written and what it is. And then like, am I satisfied with it? And if not, how can I change it to be more satified? And it kind of keeps out those like sort of editorial voices of like, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, dragons are already a big thing, and now like by the time this gets published, dragons won't be in anymore, right? Trying to guess the market that seems pretty hopeless.
Yeah, if anybody can guess the market, congratulations. Like
Totally.
you're set. Oh my goodness. Well, this has been a great conversation. How can our writers connect with you?
They're welcome to email me. Like, I'll give you my email. It's justin.i.minkel@gmail.com. Honestly, right now I'm in more of a phase of just like creating new work. I'm also on Instagram at minkeljustin. But I mostly check it when this guy in our town is going to have sourdough donuts coming out. So every like week or so that I'm really on there. But yeah, and I think I'll do like an email list at some point with just kind of sending out some of these short pieces. Like one thing I've realized is that idea of like writing for like a handful of people is really different from writing for no one. So it's kind of like
Mm,
even things that maybe you're not going to publish, like that of just sending it out to anyone who's interested in draft form and getting ideas. Lately I was like writing something in response to this really wonderful painting that a friend of mine made, and I just like emailed him about it. And so I'm gonna like give the story I wrote based on his painting to him, even if it never makes it out. So yeah, I'd love to.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's super fun. You got to prioritize the donuts, of course.
Yeah, yeah, it's really important. They're sourdough, they have amazing filling, it's like that responsibility and delight. I was gonna say one last thing if we have time. It's just,
Yeah,
Lana
absolutely.
told me that I loved that I think is helpful for writers sometimes when you're really focused on craft. I sent her a manuscript, draft of this earlier novel called The Lighthouse Keeper, and her response really helped me because she said, this is all technically really, really good as far as all the things, as far as like, world building and dialogue and description. And she said, but I have the feeling that you're sort of being careful because you have all this
Mm,
stuff in your head and you're kind of trying it out. And she said, sometimes that can get in the way of just telling a story. So I just think it is so important to kind of trust that all the craft you've learned through things like this, like camp or workshops or authors visits or whatever, like has sort of soaked into your back brain, and then just kind of like write the story and enjoy it and sort of hold it loosely and know that kind of that's what revision is for.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Yeah, because you can kind of tell if the writing feels a little stilted
Right.
or guarded. Yeah. No,
Yeah,
that's
yeah. I heard a
excellent.
writer for Hamlin say, I needed, her editor told her, I think you need to let the characters squirm out from under your grasp, and it's kind of that idea
Oh.
of like, you have this idea of your story, but your idea isn't the thing. Like Anne Patchett says, in order to write the story I'm capable of writing, I have to murder my idea of the story. And that's really interesting because you may set out with like, oh, it's this, and then you realize, oh, that's actually not what the story wants to be,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's really good. All right. Well, this has been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise with us.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Have a great summer.
Bye, everybody. We'll see you next time.